On the 7th of August, 1944, somewhere west of Falaise in occupied France, a column of German armor stretched nearly 4 kilometers along a sunken road. It was the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, Tiger war tanks, Panzer IVs, half-tracks, and fuel lorries, retreating in good order following the collapse of Operation Ludic. The column's commander, an experienced veteran of the Eastern Front, had every reason to feel secure. His Tigers were proof against almost anything the Allies could throw from the ground. Anti-tank artillery would need to come within range. Bombers needed good weather and clear skies. And Allied aircraft, well, everyone knew that attacking armor from the air was, at best, an imprecise art. The Hawker Typhoon, in particular, was supposed to be a troubled machine. Critics had spent 2 years cataloging its faults, so when the drone of Merlin engines, actually Napier Sabre engines, a distinction that matters enormously, began filling the sky above Falaise that afternoon, the column did not stop, it did not disperse. And that was the last mistake it ever made. What followed in the next 47 minutes is now studied in staff colleges across the world. 19 Typhoons from 245 Squadron and 181 Squadron swept the road in coordinated firing passes, each aircraft carrying 8 60-pound rocket projectiles beneath its wings. When the smoke cleared, the Germans had lost an estimated 46 vehicles, including armored fighting vehicles, fuel tankers, and command half-tracks. The road was so thoroughly blocked that a 2-kilometer stretch became known, quite simply, as the Corridor of Death. Here was a fighter bomber that critics had dismissed as a dangerous dead end, producing, in less than an hour, the most lethal single anti-armor strike of the entire Normandy campaign. The paradox is that none of this should have been possible. The Typhoon had spent the first 18 months of its operational life failing spectacularly. Its engine killed pilots as readily as the enemy. Its tail fell off under stress. Its rate of climb was embarrassing, and the weapon that made it a tank killer, on the RP-3 rocket projectile, was, on paper, wildly inaccurate. What transformed this troubled machine into the most feared ground attack aircraft of the European theater was not better technology. It was a specifically British approach to training, to tactics, and to the uncomfortable gap between what engineers promised and what combat actually delivered. Standard military thinking in 1942 emphasized precision. The Americans were investing heavily in high-altitude strategic bombing, built on the Norden bomb site, and the belief that with sufficient accuracy, you could win a war without risking your pilots in the grotesque close-range environments of ground attack. The Germans, meanwhile, had the Stuka, a dedicated dive bomber that could put a 250-kilogram bomb through the roof of a pillbox if the pilot was competent enough. Even the RAF's own doctrine leaned towards specialization. Light bombers for battlefield interdiction, heavy bombers for industrial targets, fighters for air superiority. The idea that a single aircraft could reliably kill a tank with an unguided rocket from a shallow dive at speeds approaching 400 miles per hour struck many theorists as wishful thinking, dressed up in engineering language. On paper, this shouldn't have worked. The RP-3 rocket, 3 inches in diameter, 60 pounds in total weight with a 25-pound warhead, had a circular error probable that could generously be described as optimistic. Early trials at Orfordness in 1942 showed that at 1,000 yards firing range, a salvo of 8 rockets might spread across an area roughly the size of a football pitch. Armor-piercing heads required a near-direct hit to penetrate a Panzer IV's hull, and a direct hit on a moving tank from a diving aircraft using an unguided projectile defied probability. German tank crews, briefed on the RP-3's statistical performance, were initially unconcerned. One captured Waffen-SS officer, debriefed in the summer of 1944, admitted that his unit's pre-deployment intelligence had described the rockets as a psychological weapon, not a technical one. Critics argued, correctly, that the RP-3 could not match the theoretical kill probability of a purpose-designed anti-tank round. They were right about the mathematics. They were catastrophically wrong about the battlefield. The secret was in what the British chose to measure. Rather than focusing on the probability of a single rocket penetrating a specific tank at a specific range, RAF planners, particularly those at the Air Fighting Development Unit at Duxford, studied what actually happened to armored formations when aircraft appeared overhead. The answer was not primarily about penetration, it was about paralysis. The RP-3 carried a 60-pound body because 25 pounds of that was warhead, and the remaining 35 pounds was motor and steel casing. When a rocket missed a tank by 3 yards and detonated, it did not scratch the armor. But it blew the track off any half-track within 5 meters, it killed or deafened exposed crew members, it ignited fuel and ammunition in soft-skinned vehicles, and, crucially, it forced every armored vehicle commander to button up, reducing their situational awareness to the narrow rectangle visible through a periscope. A tank, with its hatches closed and its crew deafened by rocket detonations, could not effectively engage ground targets, could not communicate with infantry, and could not advance with confidence. The Typhoon didn't need to kill tanks. It needed to make them tactically useless, and for that, the RP-3's generous explosive radius was not a deficiency. It was precisely correct. What actually mattered was delivery, and this is where the British trick resided. From early 1943, No. 2's Tactical Air Force began developing what instructors at the operational training units called the cab rank system, combined with a specific diving attack profile. Typhoon pilots were trained to approach their targets at 8,000 to 10,000 feet, roll into a 30-degree dive, steeper than felt natural, but shallower than the Stuka's suicidal 60-degree approach, and fire their rockets in pairs at a range of between 800 and 1,200 yards, pulling out no lower than 500 feet. The entire engagement, from roll-in to pull-out, took approximately 11 seconds. 11 seconds during which the pilot was maintaining airspeed above 350 miles per hour, correcting for dive angle, tracking a moving or stationary target, and making the instinctive ballistic corrections that no gun sight of the era could compute in real time. The reality of combat showed that this could be taught, but only through a particular kind of repetition. Unlike American training programs that relied heavily on classroom theory and then live fire evaluation, the RAF's approach was almost brutally empirical. Pilots flew dozens of practice dives against hulked-out vehicles at ranges in Scotland and Wales before they were considered combat-ready. They were not taught formulas. They were taught to feel the dive, to recognize the moment when the target filled a specific portion of the windscreen, and to make corrections based on the tracer from their 20mm cannons, which they fired simultaneously to help walk their aim onto the target before releasing the rockets. It was muscle memory masquerading as ballistics. The aircraft itself was not a gentle teacher. The Napier Sabre II engine, a 24-cylinder H configuration unit displacing 36.7 liters, was notoriously temperamental on the ground and demanded careful throttle management during the pull-out phase of an attack when the risk of losing power at low altitude was at its highest. Pilots who survived their first 30 operational sorties over France did so partly through skill and partly through an intimate, almost adversarial understanding of the aircraft's habits. Flight Sergeant Ronald Pottinger of 198 Squadron described it in a letter home as flying a lorry that occasionally tries to kill you before the Germans get their chance. That sardonic familiarity was itself a form of combat readiness. A pilot who had learned to coax the Sabre through a rough weather start at Needs Ore Point was a pilot who would not panic when the same engine coughed at 600 feet over a German column. The Typhoon demanded and produced a particular kind of practical toughness that no amount of classroom instruction could manufacture. The proof arrived in sequence, each engagement refining what the next would achieve. In February 1944, during Operation Starkey and the subsequent build-up to Overlord, Typhoons of 121 Wing flew armed reconnaissance sorties over the Seine Valley, attacking German rail and road transport. After-action reports from these missions established a crucial finding. The mere presence of Typhoons over a German column reduced its movement speed by an average of 60%, regardless of whether any vehicles were destroyed. Lorry drivers stopped. Tank commanders halted to seek cover. The operational tempo of German logistics, already strained, degraded further. You did not need to destroy a lorry to stop it delivering ammunition. You needed to make the driver afraid to move. Think in the larger proof. On the 10th of June, 1944, 4 days after D-Day, the 2nd Panzer Division was moving north from its reserve positions near Lisieux towards the beachhead. A force of Typhoons from 83 Group caught elements of the division on the road near Villers-Bocage. In a 2-hour series of strikes, the Typhoons destroyed or disabled over 100 vehicles and killed approximately 150 men. The division, which German planning had expected to reach the front within 24 hours of being released from OKW Reserve, took 4 days. Those 4 days allowed the British 7th Armoured Division to consolidate positions that would otherwise have been contested before they were established. An armoured division delayed is not identical to an armoured division destroyed, but on a battlefield where hours mattered as much as tanks, the distinction was largely academic. The Germans expected to move freely by day until Allied fighter bombers were neutralized. Instead, they encountered an opponent who had solved a different equation entirely. Not how do we destroy German armor, but how do we make German armor operationally irrelevant during daylight hours? The Typhoon, with its speed, its rugged Napier Sabre engine producing 2,260 horsepower, its ability to absorb battle damage, and its 8-rocket payload, was exactly suited to that mission. This wasn't accidental. The Typhoon's troubled early career, the carbon monoxide leaks that killed pilots, the catastrophic tail failures that plagued the Mark 1A and early Mark 1B variants, the underwhelming high-altitude performance that made it useless as a pure interceptor, had forced the RAF to ask what this aircraft was actually good at. The answer, arrived at through operational necessity rather than design intention, was low-altitude work. Below 15,000 feet, the Typhoon's thick wing section, a source of constant criticism from aerodynamicists who preferred the thinner profiles of more elegant fighters, generated enormous lift and extraordinary stability. At 400 miles per hour at 2,000 feet, it was one of the most stable gun and rocket platforms in any Air Force. The very characteristic that made it a mediocre high-altitude interceptor made it a superb low-level strike aircraft. Commanders weren't clinging to tradition. They knew that the Typhoon's stability at low altitude, combined with a cab-rank forward air control system developed by squadron leader Charles Green and refined throughout 1943, created a weapon system that the pre-war manuals had no category for. The cab-rank system placed Typhoon formations on continuous patrol over the front lines, in contact with forward controllers, officers on the ground with radio sets, positioned with the leading infantry or armour, who could direct the aircraft onto targets within minutes of identification. The average time from a tank commander on the ground calling in a target to the first rockets impacting was, by mid-1944, reduced to approximately 11 minutes. No artillery battery could respond that quickly to a target appearing 10 kilometers behind the front. Battlefields aren't testing ranges. They are chaos with geography. And the Typhoon system, aircraft, weapon, training, and command architecture taken together, had been built for chaos specifically. The RP-3's wide blast radius was an advantage in chaos. The pilot's trained instinct was more reliable in chaos than any gun sight. The cab-rank system's continuous presence meant that German commanders could never be certain there were not Typhoons orbiting above the clouds, waiting for the weather to break or a controller's call to come through. By September 1944, a German armored commander moving by day in the operational area of 2nd Tactical Air Force was making a choice between military necessity and something approaching suicide. The statistics from the Falaise pocket alone, where Typhoon attacks contributed to the destruction or capture of approximately 700 armored vehicles and the death or capture of roughly 50,000 German troops, had settled the argument that theorists were still having in 1942. The RP-3 rocket was inaccurate. The Typhoon was a troubled design. The British approach to ground attack training was improvised from operational necessity rather than doctrinal intention, and that is precisely why it worked. The trick that turned the Hawker Typhoon into a tank killer in just 11 seconds of diving fire was not a technical breakthrough. It was the willingness to discard the question the engineers were answering, how do we achieve a direct hit, and replace it with the question the battlefield was actually asking, how do we make the enemy stop moving? The answer to that question was waiting in a 30-degree dive at 350 miles per hour, 8 rockets rippling off the rails, a German column freezing on a sunken French road, and 47 minutes that changed the arithmetic of armored warfare forever.